Hi. This is to answer some of your questions about being a game tester. I'll go ahead and just go through these really quick. Hopefully this all works out for you and you get to learn something interesting about the back end of video games that most people don't actually think about. So I'll just go ahead and go through your questions real quick here. You can go ahead and call me Mr. if you want. My name is Corey, so if you want Mr. Corey or just Corey, Mr. Stelton, doesn't really matter. I'm not too particular about it. I'm just looking up here because I have your questions on the screen behind us so I can see them while I'm talking. I live in Redmond, Washington, which luckily for me is in one of the technical hubs of the United States, so outside of like Silicon Valley in California. Redmond, Seattle is pretty much the place to be, so I got lucky there. How old am I? I'm 35. I actually just turned 35 in March, so yeah, not too bad. How long do I work in a week? Well, the Office Space answer is in an average week, I probably do about a solid 20 hours of actual testing. The rest of the time is spent researching bugs, trying to figure out if what I've found has already been found by somebody else and written up. Just going through a lot of it is just trying to figure out how to use some of the tools that people give me to use, because they don't always come with instructions, which is a fun aspect of my job, is that they don't always tell you everything you need to know to do it. So there's a lot of figuring stuff out. Let's see, my typical day is pretty much, at least with Microsoft and a lot of tech places, you're kind of given some leeway as when you can show up for work. So Microsoft has what they call core hours. You have to show up anytime between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. You work 8 total hours. So you can take an hour-long lunch, you can take a 2-hour-long lunch if you want. As long as you show up between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. and you work a total of 8 hours a day, they're not too particular about the specific hours that you're there. They just want to make sure everybody's there for a good chunk of the middle of the day so that there's no real gaps in communication. But it's pretty much wake up at about 8:30 to 9, get up, breakfast. I live about 2 miles from Microsoft, so that works out well. It's about a 5-minute commute. Pop in, get the morning tea or coffee, whatever, I'm feeling for that morning. Usually it involves a lot of install the new build on whatever I'm playing or testing. Sometimes you might have a directed test pass of these specific things need to be tested. Sometimes it's just test whatever you feel like testing. So you just do that, go to lunch, come back, pretty much just test all day. You find a bug, you try and capture any video or audio or files if it generates bug logs or anything. Write it up, attach it, and send it off to a developer to give him a new headache. When did I first start playing games? When I was a kid. My brother had an Atari 2600 that he handed down to me, and I got to play on a video game console that had fake wood paneling on it. So that should date me as to how long I've been playing. After that, the Nintendo came out with their NES, and I've been doing it ever since. They kind of lost me with the GameCube. I don't particularly care for the controller setup that Nintendo's been going with for a while, but that just comes with time. See, how did I first become a game tester? I actually used to work at a game store, more like board games and card games, not really video games. But one of my friends who came in there was an assistant producer for Electronic Arts when they had a studio in Bellevue in Washington back in the very late 90s, early 2000s. So through her, she let me know, hey, they're looking for game testers, and this is, my job at the time was ending and not really a go anywhere kind of job. So yeah, I sent in my resume, went in and interviewed, and turns out that video game testing is a nerd's paradise because they don't require any college education. They pay pretty good starting out the gate, and the longer you're in the community, the more people you know and the more networked you get, and the easier it is to just find jobs and keep going up from there. So yeah, I kind of fell into a pretty nice little setup through that. Let's see. Game testing, as far as an interest, is actually just really fun. I mean, I'm kind of a nerd, so I tend to pick apart things that I like anyway, and anyone who plays video games knows that there's a million things to pick apart and bitch about. So it ends up being a pretty cool gig when somebody will pay you to basically tell them what they did wrong and how to, at least what they could do to make it better. Maybe not the specifics, because I don't know how to code, so I can't tell them how to fix it. I can just tell them what they broke and how to reproduce that break. Let's see here. How long, or was it like being a game tester? Is it fun? Is it boring? So here's the thing that a lot of people don't quite understand. No matter what you do, if you do it for 8 hours a day, whether you used to love it or hate it, you will not love it as much at the end of that 8 hours. Video game testing is no exception. You can spend 40 hours a week playing a game that's broken, that's not complete, that it's still in those initial parts of development where they don't really know what's going to happen with the game. So it's just, it's not the most fun experience in that you don't get to sit down and play a complete game from beginning to end and then just kind of give them notes. You can sit down, start the game up, and then it just crashes all the time. So you're sitting there all day trying to get past a crash just to see if the rest of the game works. And then it could just get worse from there. And then sometimes, towards the end of the project, you've been playing a game so long that even when it might be a game you love, having played it for 40 hours a week for 6 months can really drain the love out of a game. So, for instance, I used to be a tester on Halo 3 when that was in development in Bungie, when Bungie was part of Microsoft. And for 8 hours a day, for 5 days, sometimes 6 days a week, towards the end, playing Halo 3. And I got to tell you, as much as I enjoy playing Halo and first-person shooters, Halo 3 is not the first game I go to when I'm looking to unwind and enjoy some console time. So it is, at the same time, it's still pretty fun because you still get to play video games all day. And you get to kind of get a back-end look at how they work. Maybe you get to exploit some bugs before they get released to the public, so obviously they don't get released, but, you get to play around with a game in a state that not a lot of other people get to see it. So it's as fun as you can make it, but, I mean, anything you do for 8 hours a day is going to get a little monotonous. As far as how long I've been a game tester, I started in 2000. Is when I first started at Electronic Arts when they had a studio in Bellevue. I've been consistently testing kind of on and off video games or software since then, up until today. So it's been about 14 or 15 years, maybe with a break here and there to kind of get a little breather from the tech industry and, try something else out, and then realize nothing else pays as good with as little qualification requirements as the tech industry and testing. So you go back there and you get paid a lot of money to do very little work in the end. So, yeah, for 15 years now, it's actually been paying my bills and paying them pretty well and affording a very lavish geek lifestyle. So, yeah. Is there experience required to be a game tester? Yes and no. Yes, in that you have to understand video games. I've actually worked with a person who got hired who had never played video games, and when somebody was just jumping with a character, that interested and intrigued them to the point where they're like, how do you do that? It's like, well, you hit the B button, dude. I mean, this is rudimentary gaming 101, and that was this amazing thing to them, and so they just didn't last long. They couldn't even get the data entry for the games because they didn't understand the context. So as long as you understand video games and how to play them in general, that's about the only experience required, at least to start. If you want to get into the higher end testing, which is when you get into testing things like Halo, testing for groups like Nintendo, Microsoft, Valve, stuff like that, those are when they want people who have experience. If you're just starting out, you can go to Nintendo and they'll pay you $10 an hour to play video games and tell them what's wrong. And that's a good start. And that's how you get your experience for the jobs that require experience. And then, then you can start working on other stuff. But a lot of video game places, to start, you will get the push this button 100 times and time how long it takes for this to happen and document it. Don't change the format, and if anything happens, let somebody else know so they can do all of the actual work. Like you can start in a really awesome place like I did, just kind of by chance, where I got to start as an actual game tester and learn from there, or you can start in kind of the hardware aspect of do this 100 times, do this 1,000 times. You're not actually testing the video game, you're testing the console that the game is playing on. So it can be fun, it can be not. And your experience is really going to dictate the access to those fun jobs. So, but like a lot of things, you got to work your way up from the bottom, and the bottom's usually not the best part. or the most fun. Let's see, which sort of game console do I test? I've actually mostly tested Xbox stuff for Microsoft. I tested the original Xbox a little bit and games for that. I actually got to test the Xbox 360 itself when it was in development, years and years ago. And I can actually tell you the original cases were in Apple, like G5 tower cases. They weren't even in the cases that you see today. So it was kind of neat to see the original development version and what it became, today with 360s and the Slims and all that stuff. I've tested some games on the PlayStation and the PlayStation 2. I've tested a couple games on the GameCube, but like I said, I've really never preferred GameCube. In a lot of games, a company will make one game and try to port the code to different platforms. And when you do that, you get a lot of bugs that pop up because the way that you code games for the GameCube is different than how you make them for the PlayStation, which is different from the Xbox and all that. And, now it's the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One and the, Wii U or whatever the hell they're up to. But the thing is that you'll now more so than it seems some other, times in the past, is you won't get games that'll port across all platforms. Somebody will make a game and it's going to be platform specific, and you see that a lot with the recent generations. And maybe a couple generations later, the game will port over to the other consoles, but right now you end up testing mostly just one console unless it's for a studio that's got some real talent and they develop for all of the different platforms. So yeah, mostly I'm an Xbox guy, and that's probably just a byproduct of being so close to Microsoft's main campus. Let's see, what is my favorite console to test? I'm going to go again with Xbox, but slightly different reason, not because it's close, but actually it is the controller I like the layout the most of. I have gigantic hands, so the giant Xbox controllers, going back to the original Xbox, the Duke, that was always my favorite controller. The S controllers I was not a big fan of. They were a little small, but now that's kind of the standard size, so I live with it. PlayStation controllers I've always hated the layout of, and Nintendo lost me at the GameCube. That controller was atrocious. So after that, it was pretty much just, well, I like the Xbox, I like the games on the Xbox, and the controller is the one I like the most. So that's the one I prefer to test the most. And that's the one I like testing the most. I'm the most familiar with it. Let's see, how do you define a bug? A bug is literally any time the game does something that it's not supposed to. A graphical glitch. If a guy reaches, you get two characters doing a high five and their hands pass through each other, that's called clipping. And it's just, rather than they hit, it's going to be one of those like, high five. And then, they go back to doing whatever. And that's a bug. And you file that if it's a reproducible thing, crashes or bugs. If you hear an audio, hiccup or a bleep or, it's literally, if you think about a video game as a movie, any time that you would edit something out of a movie, you do that with a video game and it's called a bug. It's just a little more difficult to find them because there's a lot more involved in actually finding a bug in a video game. But it's pretty much, you have a very general idea of how the game or the app is supposed to work, and then when it doesn't do that, you let somebody know, and they tell you if they meant to do it or if it's an actual bug. And about half the time it's an actual bug, they'll still say they meant to do it because a lot of developers get really bogged down and they have to prioritize what they fix, which is also why you get games that ship with bugs, is because sometimes there was something more important that needed to be fixed, and the time allowed dictated they could only fix so many bugs, and some were deemed acceptable to ship. So that is kind of the long way of explaining a bug is basically anytime the game or program does something it's not supposed to. What type of bugs would I encounter? It's everything. It can be the game crashes, it can be the machine crashes, it can be hardware failures based on just the way the game runs and accesses the hardware on stuff. Audio, video, networking, multiplayer, any aspect of the game, text, spelling errors, graphical, grammar errors, all of that is fair game for bugs. So really, anything can be a bug. If it exists in a software or a game, it can be a bug. How do you apply for a game testing job? That's going to be a little more localized. Craigslist actually has QA, quality assurance is kind of the general term for most testing in the tech world, QA, quality assurance. They have a section specifically for QA and software people, so you might find jobs posted there. There's a lot of temp agencies, Volt or VMC, Tech Systems, Collabra, Aditi. There's a ton of different, basically, temp agencies, Kelly Girls, for testing world, where they have the access to the jobs. You send them your resume. They forward the resume to the other people. You interview with somebody, and then eventually, if you're lucky, you'll get a job pushing buttons on a controller and, telling somebody why the dude isn't jumping like he's supposed to. It's mostly online. I happen to have gotten in kind of when it was a little more analog, so I had a friend who I gave my resume to, and she gave it to people and like that. So now it's going to be a lot of LinkedIn, Facebook kind of stuff, but it's mostly digital. You got to find stuff on Monster.com or on Craigslist are the two big ones that I find work through. And then you just kind of apply, and your resume should highlight any technical experience you have with computers, and that's kind of the way you go. How do you uncover bugs? Do you use one control repeatedly or finish the game? It's a lot. I used to do what was called rabbit testing, which is you just finish the game as fast as possible from beginning to end. So that way you can find those end game bugs of you finish this quest, but it doesn't give you the item. So you can't, complete or continue. And if that's the, 30 hours of gameplay in, they need to find that as soon as possible. So that's one type of testing. Sometimes, like I said, it's just push the button a whole bunch and see what happens. You'll do different kind of boundary tests where you actually just run along the border of a level, try to find the places where you can fall through the map or escape the map and get to a place where you're not supposed to be. It's really up to you and how creative you are with trying to break video games. And really, boredom ends up being a big part of it. Is you get bored with playing the game, and then you start investigating the game a little more. What is the most challenging problem I've had to overcome? This is probably politically incorrect, but whatever, I don't care. Developers' egos are by far and away the most challenging problem to ever overcome, because people are making a video game, and some people consider it art. It's a passion for some people. Depending on the game, there could be a lot of money, it could be a lot of notoriety. I mean, there's a lot involved, and in all of that, you get egos. And you get a lot of people who invest a lot of themselves in their work. And so when you're, like I said, my job is basically to tell people how they did their job wrong and how something that they needed to make work is broken. So that inherently is kind of an antagonistic relationship where I'm only ever critiquing their work. I'm never applauding their work. So the opposite side of that coin is somebody else sits there and all they get is negative feedback all day. So if I'm not diplomatic in how I phrase that, I can get a bug returned to me that says, yeah, this isn't a bug, or yeah, we meant to do this, or we don't consider this a priority, so we just aren't going to fix it, or we'll fix it later. And sometimes the way you phrase the bug doesn't get the actual problem across. Sometimes it's just a developer who thinks they know what's best, and you are just a lowly tester. There is kind of a weird class warfare system that happens in the tech world, where if you're a contractor, you're not really looked at the same as a full-timer, and if you're just a tester, developers tend to not give you the same amount of respect as they give other developers, because you're not as technically oriented as them and not viewed as quite as necessary and more easily replaceable. So when you combine all of that, you get a relationship where basically my job is to tell somebody they did something wrong and try to convince them that it's okay. It just needs to be fixed, and if they could do that, it would be awesome. As opposed to, you broke something, fix it, or else. But really, that's the biggest problem. Is sometimes people just really don't want to listen, and there's not a whole lot you can do with that when you're a tester, because you don't really wield a lot of power. If power was a sword, I would have a butter knife in relation to my job. Do games usually have tons of issues, or are they almost always flawless? I have never seen a game that didn't have any massive bugs. I mean, the simplest programs and the simplest games start with the most horrific issues. I mean, everything crashes at first, regardless of what it is. I'm working on Windows right now. I probably can't tell you the exact aspect of it, but I can tell you I'm working on a Microsoft Windows related project, and aspects, and I've worked on Windows, I worked on Windows 7, I worked on Windows 8, and I can tell you from experience that even technologies that have been stable for years, DVD playback and messaging and webcams and just connecting to the internet and networking, these things always break. initially whenever you're doing anything. A new version of Windows, the networking isn't going to work right off the bat because you can't just copy and paste the code. A brand new video game is always going to have issues. A brand new app is always going to have issues. So I honestly don't think there has ever been a single program written that didn't have at least one, and I'm talking about the simplest, like display a text type program, didn't have at least one bug, if not one massive bug. Most of them, the databases will go up into the tens of thousands of bugs per game. So every video game you see out there likely had thousands, tens of thousands. The bigger ones like Halo maybe have hundreds of thousands of bugs written on them per game. So next time you walk into a GameStop, just take a look at that wall and think about how many issues were found and fixed per game. Look at every game, multiply it by 10,000. That's how many problems exist in this job. What is my average salary? That all depends. Like I said, it really depends on what company you're going through, if you're a contractor, what level of tester you are. The base level I've ever heard of way back in 2000, Nintendo was starting people out at $10 an hour. I was making $12.50 at Electronic Arts, and I was living in a heyday. Right now, I make between $25 and $30 an hour, testing mostly software. Some video game testing, but it's mostly been software stuff. And that's kind of the average higher end. I've almost topped out at where I can go without having a college degree or knowing how to program or anything. So at this point, I'm perfectly comfortable. I mean, I make easily middle-class lifestyle. I have no wife or kids, so I have more than enough income to deal with everything. You know, the lower end stuff, the earlier, more entry-level positions are probably going to pay closer to the low teens. You know, if you get lucky, you maybe get high teens, early 20s. It really depends on where you get picked up and what kind of, you know, game you're testing. Do I think game testing is useful? If so, why? I absolutely think it's useful for at least two reasons. One, it employs me, so that's always a bonus in my world. And two, as I said, I mean, just pick up any given video game and think of 10,000 things that can go wrong, and they did, and they were filed and fixed. And if it weren't for testing, video games just wouldn't exist. No one would deal with this because you couldn't play them. I mean, it would take forever to develop and release anything, and it would just not work without testing. I mean, testing really is the, you know, it's going to sound a little egotistic, but testing is what allows a game to get published because that's where you find the problems. Like, developers create the problems, testers find the problems for the developers to fix. It's a very symbiotic relationship where you need both, but, you know, in the end, without testing, you just can't go anywhere. You're just never going to find the issues you need to find. What do you do if you find a bug? I think I went over that. You log as much as you can. You go over the steps, exactly how to reproduce it if possible. You take video, you take screenshots, you get audio capture if you can. Sometimes there's a program that creates log files that tells developers whatever they need to know, and you run that, get your files attached to your bug. There's usually a database where they're sent and triaged and then dealt with accordingly. But it's actually a pretty simple, quick process once you get into it. It's just everybody's got their little ways of doing things. What's the workplace like? It varies. Sometimes you're in a cube farm, which actually isn't too bad. Sometimes, you get a little space to yourself. Sometimes you're shoulder to shoulder, just on a big line of computers sitting on a bench with other people. You could be in an office with a couple people. You could be in an office by yourself. It's pretty relaxed. I mean, it's jeans and t-shirt. Most people are wearing Star Wars and nerd-based t-shirts. You're not going to get a whole lot of dress code violations. Like, it's pretty much wear clothes that cover you, ideally. So it's a pretty casual environment, which is why I really like it. I'm not a suit and tie kind of guy. So the environment's pretty casual. The physical workplace is going to depend on where you're at. Mostly it's going to be a cube farm or sitting on a line next to 2 or 3 other people doing, similar stuff. How do I think I'll be able to improve game testing in the future? Really, it's just experience. A lot of automation is getting brought into the mix, and it's a good thing because automation can cover a lot of scenarios and a lot of testing that you can't afford or really realistically get through with just, manual testers. So that definitely helps, but a lot of places rely on that too much, and you start losing the manual aspect, and you start not finding the things that people find. You only find the things that machines find. And the thing about having a person behind the controller is I think differently than a machine. I think outside of the box. The machine is the box, so it only thinks within itself. I think a little more creatively than a machine, so therefore I will likely, as a human being, find problems that a machine will not. And some major software releases had issues with over-reliance on stuff like that and under-reliance or under-usage of certain aspects of testing. And that was a lesson that was hard learned, and they have since gone back and fixed. But really, it's game testing in the future. It's going to be about the same. It's really the technology that changes that lets us test. So I hope this was informative. Hopefully I didn't ramble too long for you. I realize this is about 25 minutes now. So hopefully you got a good educational experience out of this. So thanks for your interest.